So first of all, I mean, thank you very much for taking the time to sit down and chat with me today. It's a pleasure. It's an honor. Um, so I guess for those out there who haven't heard of you or your work, um, how would you describe yourself? Because I think you actually wear many hats. In reading about kind of the some of your writing that you've done and some of the things that you've done, I feel like it's not easy to peg you down with one label or one kind of moniker.
Mm. Well, you're being very generous. An honor to speak with you too. And I'm a writer, if you really need a label. I'm trained as a historian. I'm a historian of modern European intellectual history, largely philosophy and social thought in the 19th and 20th centuries in Germany, France, and beyond. And I've also been a food writer for a long time. Uh, After college, actually during college and after college, I did odd jobs in restaurants and cafes, and then bartered that into food writing for magazines
Mm.
and journals while I was doing my PhD. And the consequence was that I ended up juggling a lot of different kinds of writing and a lot of different kinds of thinking, some of which brings us together today, since you asked me to speak a little bit about the recent work I've been doing that touches on uh, cultured meat or artificial meat, and animal lives, the relationship between human and animal lives, and the philosophy of eating animals. I should say, though, that one of the things that I really value in my own intellectual life is the idea that all of a person's interests don't need to be unified. Am I right in thinking that you study physics? Is that right?
Yes, I come from, and I'm currently studying astrophysics. Yes.
Terrific, terrific. So you may well have a story to tell about how astrophysics relates to some of your other interests. And I do have stories I could tell about how writing about food, writing about restaurants, writing about coffee might relate to writing about philosophy. But in my own life and for myself, I prefer to leave these interests disparate because I think it's more true to the character of my intellectual life. I've always been maybe fundamentally compelled by philosophical questions, and I became a historian because I think that philosophical questions in the abstract are less satisfying than in the way that they are asked and answered by contextualized human beings. And maybe some of those same intellectual tools apply to my food writing in different ways. But on the other hand, sometimes I just get interested in things. And the nature of a project, whether it's a review of a barbecue restaurant or a review of a book about animals and philosophy, just calls for different kinds of tools, intellectually in terms of writing. So that's my spiel about labels. I primarily work as a writer and editor, and I sometimes teach in intellectual history and in anthropology.
So, well, it's funny as you were mentioning that this idea of kind of not wanting to label yourself, or maybe the difficulty of slapping on a single label. I think in terms of your book that brought us together, or that brought you to my attention, which was Meat Planet. That too, I think when I've talked to people about it, and they say, "Oh, what's it about?" I've said I've sometimes struggled because I said, "Well, it's about cultured meat. It's about the story of cultured meat." But then I tell them about these interesting kind of, I wouldn't say they're digressions, but these interesting directions you take things, where you start talking about not just kind of the story of the first hamburger in 2013 and onwards, but as you're living in this world and kind of in the midst of things, you talk about different philosophical topics, different historical things, and it's this kind of merging together of a lot of different fields, and I thought the form and the way that the book was put together was particularly interesting, because there's some anecdotes, there's some talks of philosophy, and I'm curious what is that just kind of you write how you write, or is there any thought process that comes into when you're writing this and pulling at these different threads?
Oh, thank you for that question. Yeah, no, it's hard to answer, of course. But you're right that I write how I write.
Yeah.
But I think that I tried to make a virtue of it in this case by choosing to write in ways that might challenge the assumptions of someone interested in what I call cultured meat and what other people call variously clean meat, cultivated meat, or bat meat, or schmeat, or open meat. Many of the people who are interested in this world are interested in it because they have a strong ideological commitment to veganism, to the end of industrial animal agriculture, to environmental protection, and they see this technology as a means to achieve that end, those ends. And that's well and good. They might well expect a book on the topic to be in the style of many narratives about inventors, engineers, and entrepreneurs, a hero narrative about the wonderful people who try to bring about this wonderful future reality in which we can consume bacon without ever killing an animal. So we have a thing that we call Canadian bacon. And I don't know what it's called in Canada. Like, you know, is this a familiar problem for you? Like,
so I don't eat, I haven't eaten meat for a while, and I'm trying to remember, even when I was younger, because we came from a Jewish upbringing, bacon was not really generally on the menu, even though we're not really that kosher, or I shouldn't even say that kosher. We weren't really kosher, but bacon was really, it just wasn't really something we ate much. So I was never well versed in the world of bacon of types. I know of Canadian bacon, but it is an interesting question. What do they just call it bacon? You think I would know.
Well, you know, I mean, Canadian bacon, the Canadians could easily refer to it as, Mexican bacon, or Paraguayan bacon.
Yeah.
But no, I'm also from a Jewish family, but one so unkosher that I know a lot about bacon. Canadians call Canadian bacon, if they call it anything.
Yeah.
So there have been several books written about laboratory grown meat from different perspectives, primarily by journalists and activists. And I set out to write a book that would be nothing like that. And I did that because I thought it was what the conversation needed, and it was what I needed intellectually.
Let me just say, you achieved that because having read a lot of these other pieces in these books, and I think when you were describing kind of the person who this sort of hero who the some of these books portray, I think that's something that I was expecting, and coming from the stance of someone who's probably more looking at these new food technologies with this idea that they can help bring about, like you said, the end of animal agriculture and factory farming and whatnot. I think I was looking at the book kind of thinking, oh, so this is going to be a similar story to what I've maybe seen before, but maybe some written in a different way or from a different perspective. And I was kind of, I was pleasantly surprised that you came at it, not someone who is vegan, not someone who's part of the community, but just literally kind of, if you were to take someone and plop them down inside of this community and they were just looking around and recording back to you what they were observing without any biases one way or the other.
Well, there's a strong bias in the book, I think, which is a bias against hype, and maybe against some of the comfortable assumptions that people bring to stories about technology in the future, and comfortable narratives people have about moral philosophy. So one of the things that I did, because I was curious about what you do on your podcast, was listen to the conversation you had with Peter Singer.
Mm.
And one of the things that I was thinking to myself was, well, I mean, does Ruben know how much I disagree with Singer? Does Ruben know how hostile to the Singer-verse I am? How silly I think so much of it is? And yeah, I mean, there's a chapter called Philosophers in which a bunch of activists interrupt Peter Singer and talk about how unhappy with him they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I used that as an opportunity to ask hard questions about the philosophical assumptions, consequentialist, utilitarian, of many people in the cultured meat world.
Mm-hmm.
And I do that because I think that it's very easy for them to proceed with those assumptions unquestioned. So my conviction about cultured meat is that regardless of its realities, which of course we'll talk about today, its philosophical implications are far more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, even if cultured meat never materializes in food technology, which is still uncertain, I think people who assume that it will are simply wrong to assume that. Fortunately, we can nevertheless talk about its philosophical implications. Now,
Mm-hmm.
we couldn't have asked for a better kind of thought experiment for those of us who like thought experiments to roll out of Silicon Valley.
Mm-hmm.
So I've given you a mild provocation there, and do with it what you will.
No, well, I mean, for I guess as the name of the platform and the website and the podcast suggests, I mean, the real goal of for me and the rest of the people who kind of work on this project is for kind of open discourse, for free speech. So I mean, having someone like Peter Singer on and having someone like you on who, if you guys have differing opinions about things, that's great. Let's talk about those differing opinions and let's put it out there and just let's see how people react and what they think. I think that's great to just kind of discuss these things and kind of put it out in the open. And I guess that's kind of the whole idea behind Speakeasy.
And I suppose that if I do agree with Peter Singer about something, and there are probably many things I agree with him about, it's just that his approach to the question of the philosophy of animal life and suffering runs so contrary to my own philosophical instincts that I find myself thinking about that a lot. If we agree about something, it's I think a kind of commitment to public debate and some versions of the freedom of speech towards that end. One of the things that I've done since Meat Planet came out is return to some of the philosophical priors of the book. And in particular, I became very interested in the work of a philosopher named Helen Korsgaard, who's a Kantian, who's very interested in the question of animal lives, and very uninterested in the utilitarian calculus of animal suffering that I think has become so familiar to us. And her question is usually something like, what are the things that being around non-human animals illuminates for us about being human? And that's not a question that sits easily with the world of asking about suffering and about trying to figure out how to maximize happiness and minimize suffering in the world. It's an entirely different kind of curiosity. And I have been working on an article coming out in the edited volume soon about what I think the philosophical presuppositions of most people in the cultured meat world forecloses. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful of a sentence, so just say it differently. I think there are questions about the differences between animal lives and human lives that a focus on the moral issue of suffering and happiness alone tend to obscure.
I see. And oh, sorry, go ahead.
Please.
I was just gonna, well, I had kind of two things now that I was wondering. One was, I was curious if you could speak maybe a little to, at least as insofar as philosophy and animal lives and suffering, how your views differ than Peter Singer's. And then secondly, I think the point you had just made was that some of these presuppositions by those in the cultured meat industry obscures some nuance, maybe, or some topics are swept under the rug. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate that. I'm curious.
For sure, for sure. Well, one of Peter Singer's earlier interlocutors, Tom Reagan, whose work you may be aware of, who's unfortunately, I think, passed years ago, articulated a critique of utilitarianism as applied to animal lives and animal suffering, suggesting that when we're interested in suffering and happiness, and when we tend to abstract them as consequentialists tend to from the individuals who experience these things, we end up with an oddly abstract picture in which those beings themselves do not matter. And Reagan suggested that we instead think of creatures as subjects of a life. I think that that's an interesting idea, that we think not just about whether or not a cow in a concentrated animal feeding operation is suffering or not, but we think about that animal, that particular animal, as having a kind of a creatureliness. Now, somebody like Korsgaard might look at that cow and say, well, this cow doesn't really think of its life as a project in the way that I think of my life as a project, or we have no evidence that cows think of their lives as projects. But nevertheless, this is a being who, and again, as the utilitarians might say, can be satisfied or unsatisfied. And this is a great, powerful concept within utilitarian thought that I think it is useful in some ways. That is the notion of satisfaction, because the cow and I undoubtedly have different needs. Well, for the sake of the conversation, let's pretend that the cow and I have different needs, but they're both subject to satisfaction. And they can be met or not met. So you have this, going back to Tom Reagan's view, you have this idea that animals, to be moral subjects with any kind of real standing, can't simply be receptacles for moods. And the view that they can be can lead us to strange ideas about the malleability of the constituent forces on Earth, or the constituent, I should say, aggregate of beings on the Earth, in which what really counts, forgive me for going over material I know you're so familiar with, what really counts is how it adds up to saying that what also might count is who are the individual constituents who are experiencing these things one way or another. It always seems strange to me to hear Peter Singer discussed as one of the sort of parental figures of the animal rights movement, when what Singer offers in Animal Liberation is not a theory of rights, not even remote, or a theory of what about animals might make them the kinds of things that can have rights. So, well, that's the way in which I think that my set of views differs from Singer in substantial ways. I'm not a utilitarian. I'm closer to being a Kantian in some respects. Not that Kant himself was particularly great on our treatment of animals. But I think that on some level, there are questions about the treatment of creatures as ends as opposed to means that Kant helps us towards better than utilitarianism. However, the other reason I'm anti-utilitarian has to do with a weird kind of alliance between people of a certain philosophical disposition and people of a certain technocratic disposition that came to be arguably in the Enlightenment, um, but has unfolded in a particularly interesting way in the later 20th and early 21st century, and is manifest in some ways in the world of entrepreneurs and technologists who want to make cultured meat happen and want to replace industrially raised and slaughtered and processed conventional meat with a lab-grown culture. And I realize that we haven't even talked about the question of that science itself, its viability, what the challenges are. I'd love to get there, but there has been a kind of collusion between people who are concerned chiefly with consequences and people who love the idea of having technological levers to pull to change the world. I think the elective affinity between consequentialism, that is to say, the umbrella under which utilitarianism falls, and instrumentalism is kind of obvious, but to just tease it out for a moment, if you're chiefly concerned with outcomes and consequences, philosophically speaking, you might find a set of engineering projects that suggest that major problems in the world are amenable to things like technology or even the forces of the market. You might find that very pleasant. You might, it would be a happy story for you about your ability to change things, particularly if you found rich enough people to help you. Clever enough people, rich enough people. This puts us squarely in the world of the TED conference. And Meat Planet is a book that tries to be the opposite of a TED Talk. If TED Talks are clean and neat performances, there's a messiness to Meat Planet that I really tried to provide the reader with. You don't always know where you are. You don't always know what the consequences of things will be. There's a wonderful line, I believe this is Bernard Williams, criticizing utilitarianism, saying that utilitarians prefer for problems to be technical in character than for there to be such a thing as moral ambiguity. For technical ambiguity or technical complexity to moral complexity. Perhaps because the latter is so upsetting. I'm garbling the quotation here, but and I think that applies to instrumentalism as much as it does to utilitarianism. So I know it's terribly dissatisfying for many of my readers. I know it's terribly dissatisfying for many of my interlocutors in the cultured meat world. But I felt that I was being presented with a series of fairly clean-cut narratives about how a new technology would change things. And I'm a historian. I'm trained to be sensitive to contingencies and to see everything as messier and bumpier. And elevator pitches suggest they'll be. So that's what I do.
And I definitely think, like I said, I think that definitely came through. And like, I think I probably belong to the group who, I shouldn't say probably, I definitely belong to the group who is hitching my cart to cultured meat and really hoping that this is going to be the way to bring about these sort of large scale changes. But it was quite refreshing to read the book and have you writing and talking about the not so, it's not so cut and dry. There is murkiness to it, and talking about getting into some of the kind of getting down in the mud and rolling around a little bit and talking about these things where in some people, I guess, who are coming from where I am, maybe don't want to think about those things or think that cultured meat on the whole is going to bring about more good than it will have kind of maybe some downsides. And I mean, I guess that kind of leads into a question I was wondering, which was having spent so much time in this world of cultured meat and doing your research, when you look at cultured meat, what it is purported to be, if it could be what it is purported to be, are there downsides? Is it all upside?
Wait, so Ruben, you're asking me if cultured meat could be, let's say, what its promoters say,
Mm-hmm.
it will be,
Yes.
would it be good?
Yes. What in your estimation, do you see it as all checking boxes? It takes care of ethical concerns and health concerns and environmental concerns, or are there nuances to this technology coming into the space and other things being kind of left in the lurch?
Oh, I see. I see. I see. I see. Well, one way to answer your question, I guess, is to say that I would love to be like you. I would love to be able to hitch my cart to this particular lab-grown horse and
Mm-hmm.
see where it takes us. I started this project hoping that laboratory-grown meat was far further along as a project than it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
And if it were possible to replace the shrimp in Hargao, if it were possible to eat a lab-grown pork cutlet, if it were possible to eat chicken that had been grown in a lab and have it do the things that a chicken I roast in the oven will do, I would be pro that.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't ever be pro the utter elimination of animal agriculture, in part because I think that there are ways of relating to animals that we have or can have when we steward them in responsible and humane ways that are good. And there are aspects of food culture that come from living with animals and dealing with some of the parts that eaters in the developed West often don't eat anymore, awful, that are good, right? So there are things about what we might call meat culture that I wouldn't want to lose.
Mm-hmm.
But if we could replace the McDonald's hamburger with a lab-grown alternative in the cost-effective, healthy, environmentally sound, animal cruelty-free ways that this nascent industry promises us, yeah, I'd be totally into that. I think it would just be a good thing. I've always been, I think, in the most abstract way, a celebrant, promoter, and fan of the project, but a skeptic and a critic about many of the ways it plays out, and many of the ways it's promoted. And that's ended up being one of the roles that I play in conversations about it. Are there things that, to go back to the way you asked the question, are there ways that the project of cultured meat might ignore other solutions to our problems? Yeah. And this is one of the things I tried to get at in Meat Planet through the idea of imaginative closure. And imaginative closure is just fancy language for saying that when we strain ourselves to imagine one thing, it often closes down our ability to imagine others. It is one way of saying that for the hammer holder, there are a lot of nails in the world. And there are other ways of looking at the root problems that cultured meat purports to solve. So new technologies are not just solutions to problems, they're also framings of a problem. Sometimes they're ways of sort of constellating a problem. And to play with this a little bit, and if I can ask you a question instead, I'm kind of curious, if I said self-driving cars are the solution, and then asked you what the problem is, what would you say?
My gut, my immediate reaction is road safety. That's what my immediate reaction would be road safety. I'm trying to think of the impetus for having a car that's driving itself would be something like road safety, something like I mean, giving people more time out of their day to be productive. I mean, if they're being, I guess, using transportation to get from point A to point B, that can give people more time to be productive. Those are the two that jump out to me.
Yeah, I mean, those are great. I would say that they both make a lot of sense. But the one I would turn the question again. If road safety is the problem, why is simply finding a replacement for the car the most obvious solution to the problem? Is it, or is it the one that seems most expedient to a set of people who have convened at a particular table to try to talk about that? The political scientist, actually, I may be getting his disciplinary origins wrong. Langdon Winner is almost as much a philosopher of science as anything. Langdon Winner, who's a major figure in the science and technology studies world, I think either began as a political theorist or as a philosopher, has a wonderful essay called "Do Artifacts Have Politics?", in which he looks at technologies as things that have a relationship to political presuppositions. They serve particular constituencies. They have the interests of some interest groups baked into them, as it were. Look at contemporary conversations about how some algorithms can be trained by sets in such a way as to make them return quote unquote racist outputs. That's a great example. One of Langdon Winner's own examples were underpasses leading to beaches on Long Island outside New York City that were too low for public city buses from New York to pass under.
This was with Robert Moses, right?
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. So you could say that whether it's a self-driving car or laboratory-grown meat, any new technology isn't innocent of political inputs and outputs. And when we say, well, self-driving cars, okay, well, why did we end up with cars in the first place, is how the conversation might then run. Why is that a good way to have cities? Why is that a good way to have transportation? Why are people busy to such a degree that 20 extra minutes to read on their way to work is of great value, so they should be in the self-driving car rather than driving themselves? Why are they living that way? So this is an elaborate way of saying that when we imagine one angle of approach to a problem, we have already abandoned others. And in the book, I argue that cultured meat is a solution to the problem of meat that ignores several things. And one of those things is the sheer economic model of market growth and population growth that helped wind us up in a position in which meat is extraordinarily bad, not only for animals, but for the planet. That meat, in fact, and not just cultured meat, but meat itself became a kind of high status food consumed in the Western diet. And as the Western diet spreads through its globalization around the world, you have really nasty consequences, not just the spread of CAFOs and other forms of meat production, but also very meat-heavy diets. Unfortunately, meat's prestige status doesn't seem to be going anywhere. But the idea that you simply replace it with other things that are benign because they're made by other means seems to me to ignore the real root question, which has to do with why we're living this way and why we don't see food questions as political and social rather than technical.
And do you think? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Please.
I was just wondering, a lot of the questions you had posed about, for example, is kind of cultured meat. It's one angle of attack at this problem. What about X, Y, or Z? A lot of these questions that you're posing, do you believe there is an answer to these questions, or these are just are these to be discussed by hopefully a large swath of people, and hopefully through that discussion we come towards some sort of consensus?
Yeah, you're putting pressure on the thing that I like to do the least, and I appreciate it. You've already picked up on the fact that I'm not trying to offer solutions in the book. And it's not because I think that solutions are for dumb people, but rather because I think that the mentality according to which there is a solution to drive for forecloses a lot of necessary conversation and leaves a lot of people without a seat at the table in the first place. I really think that one of the intriguing things about cultured meat is that, which would solve a lot of problems if it worked. And that's a huge if. It really would. But again, huge if. Cultured meat resembles other kinds of ideas that empowered actors in the wealthy West have had about feeding the rest of the world, and about how all of the world's problems might be solved if people would just do what we want them to do. And this is, as I suspect you know, a trope in animal activism. Why won't they just listen to us? We obviously have the right answers, but people don't necessarily agree about the right individual answers, or even about the moral standing of animals. So one of the things that I'm at pains to do in the book is to say, well, I think that industrial animal agriculture is bad. I also eat meat, some of which is undoubtedly produced in cafés. I don't consider myself to be a completely morally upstanding actor. And I try to find something useful in that, because I think that the issue of meat contains a considerable gray area that the usual framing of cultured meat neatly leaves out. I don't know if I've answered your question.
I see. In terms of you're talking about kind of the morality of animal agriculture, eating animals, killing animals. What would you say to a simplified argument that is, I don't need to eat animals to survive. In fact, I can live without eating animals. I can live quite a healthy life. So if I don't need to cause suffering, I shouldn't. What would you say to a very simplified argument that goes along those lines?
Well, I suppose there are ways of simply agreeing with it and saying, yeah, that's probably right. That seems correct. You don't need to do this thing. It seems to cause suffering. The should in there is complicated. Where does it come from?
Where does what come from?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm returning the question to you. I'm asking where the should comes from.
The should in
your initial proposal.
So my proposal was, let me see if because I think maybe I forgot where my should was. So I said, if I can thrive and survive without eating animals, and without causing suffering, then why not? I guess it was posed as more of a question. I guess maybe not necessarily I should, although maybe there's an implicit should in there.
Well, no. So what I suppose I'm suggesting is that when you set it up that way, you're saying that either the suffering of the animal matters, and again, that would be the sort of utilitarian thing, or the animal themselves, even if you've never met them, matters. And the question becomes why. And why do we presume that the animal has that dignity or doesn't have that dignity? So I, by and large, agree with the statement that you offered at the beginning. You said it was simplistic, but I still think it's basically right. That if you could show me that my consuming an animal caused its suffering, that it wasn't an animal that was humanely treated. It wasn't slaughtered at the end of an otherwise happy life in whatever way we consider animal happiness. Then yeah, I would basically buy your proposal. And that's the basis on which I consider myself to be in some ways a bad moral actor. Now, this may divide me from many people who find utilitarianism pleasing. I think that there was a current in the history, or a kind of impulse in utilitarian thought that's really laudable, which is to use its calculus of happiness and suffering to produce gadfly-like inquiries into why people do things in the world. To say, well, we shouldn't be racist, we shouldn't be sexist, we shouldn't be prejudiced against non-human animals, and so forth. And here's a good reason, right? There have been many kinds of productive interrogations of the social order in utilitarianism's history. And yet, I think that what's happened is that, and this is partly through the career of Peter Singer, we've seen a kind of industrialization of utilitarianism. That is to say, to the point which it becomes a kind of consumer item, as opposed to a form of philosophical inquiry. And I think that's kind of dangerous. So the book Animal Liberation, for example, isn't really a philosophical book. It's a book that contains a small amount of philosophy and a very great deal of detail about how animals have been mistreated. And it's horrifying, and it's correct. Singer's correct to think that all of this is wrong. The question is he right? Are his reasons right? Is the way he sees it philosophically interesting or provocative or useful? And that might be how I start to take my own distance from him, or from somebody who feels strongly influenced by him. So again, it's not to say that it's wrong to say that if I can live a happy life, a reasonably healthy life, without causing suffering to other beings, well, then I shouldn't cause them suffering. It's not that that's wrong. It's just that it isn't necessarily the perspective on either philosophy or our relationship to other animals that I think is necessarily fine or authoritative. But you can tell, and Ruben, you already said this, that I am not terribly interested in answers.
You like posing questions.
Yeah, I do. But I also think that some of these problems are too important to have singular answers. And they're too important, and they're too intrinsically political, which means that the human actors who are interested in them will have competing answers. And they will have to have debates if we want to proceed democratically. So unless you can hope for a despotic, technocratic future in which enlightened philosopher kings use cultured meat to eliminate suffering, then you have to face up to the political nature of our food system.
Could you not say that, for example, or maybe my thought is that if I'm thinking about cultured meat and saying it's only one angle of attack and we don't want to limit ourselves or constrain ourselves to just that one because there are potentially a plethora of options out there, would it be fair to say that approaches like plant-based meat, approaches like what's been done probably for 50 plus years by animal activists, what's being done maybe through legislation, those are all maybe working somehow hand in hand as instead of maybe attacking it from one angle, it's maybe attacking it from a bit of a larger angle?
Well, certainly. I mean, this gets us back to the issue of imaginative closure. When you think that, say, technology plus the market is the way you achieve social change, well, then I become curious. Why does somebody believe that? In the case of somebody like Bruce Friedrich at the Good Food Institute, which is one of the nonprofits that promotes plant-based and cultured meat, although they don't like that term, alternatives to conventional agriculture. Well, there's an interesting story in that Friedrich was involved in very direct animal activism for decades before getting involved with venture capital and the idea of using technology in the market as a means to achieve change that he felt that activism and politics didn't achieve. So in Meat Planet, one of the things I try to do is to tell the stories of these alternative approaches to the problem by observing that many of the actors in the cultured meat world have already abandoned other approaches. And they have arrived at technology almost out of exhaustion with other possibilities. I think chickpeas are delicious and that people should eat chickpeas. I say this a lot.
I eat a lot of chickpeas.
Yeah, chickpeas are great. If you're vegan, chickpeas are a really important protein source. You can make hummus with tahini with chicken. You can do anything with chickpeas.
It's a miracle legume.
Yeah, so I think that there's something very odd about trying to create meat alternatives rather than simply eat all kinds of vegetables, legumes, etc. And one of the things that I suggest, maybe not as strongly as I will vocally in Meat Planet, is that there's a kind of a cynicism in the world of creating meat alternatives. The way of saying, those dumb shitheads want a burger, we'll give them a burger. We can't trust them to eat right. So we have to make them this like fake meat false idol for them to worship. And that's how we'll win.
I think I do agree with that to some extent, but I do think that there is, I think that maybe some people like the Bruce Friedrichs or some people who came from that animal activism background or trying to change kind of hearts and minds through kind of boots on the ground sort of methods. I think there was maybe after X amount of years, I know the movement has maybe been going on in its maybe modern form for maybe 50 plus years or so, but kind of this idea of it's just not working. We're just not seeing the results and trying to maybe say, okay, we've given it a go going down that route. Maybe try something else. Do you think that's I mean, when I've talked about this topic with friends, I don't know, part of me is convinced that appeals to, well, I guess this is a difficult topic, but appeals to one's ethics. And that's a very different, like we just had this talk about that question I posed, and it's not so cut and dried, but to try to make maybe an appeal to one's ethics about suffering, or to make an appeal to the environment or an appeal to health, it doesn't seem to be what's going to make that change. It seems like, I know Bruce Friedrich talks a lot about price, taste, and convenience, and those three being the big, when it comes to consumers, those three things being what they place above pretty much all else. And if that is the case, do you neglect that and say, let's stick with what we're doing? Or do you see that and say, let's give people what they want and also try to make change at the same time?
Well, my answer to this returns us to a point I was trying to make earlier, which is the question of what is meat consumption an index of? Populations, markets, the need for the whole system to keep growing in particular ways. Climate change isn't going to stop if we eat Impossible burgers. It's not necessarily, cultured meat isn't necessarily that much more environment friendly than conventional animal agriculture. There are, as you're probably aware, a number of projections for this that argue with each other. It's all hypothetical at this point. And it seems to me that the scale of our civilization is a much greater problem than meat itself.
Mm.
And that the fact that meat has become problematic in this way over the last 70 years or so is not itself a root cause, but rather symptomatic. This is perhaps where one of the things on which I differ from my interlocutors at places like GFI.
Mm.
I don't think that problems will be solved in any deeply meaningful way by shifting to, I don't think that those problems at least will be solved in a meaningful way that matters over the long run by simply shifting to other kinds of highly processed industrial alternatives.
So do you think, again, I don't want to put you in the position of offering solutions, because I know that's a interesting, that's different waters, but do you honestly believe that through some mechanism, some means, we could get people to just eat more fruits and vegetables?
I see. No, I'm not sure. Sure. I don't think I have an answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's not inappropriate to ask me for a solution, since I've been poo-pooing other ones. But it's really not the business that I'm in.
Yeah.
I think that it would be much better for governments to invest in their own agricultural bases as best possible. It would be better to educate and train new generations of farmers, because the average age of people engaged in agriculture is relatively advanced for the kind of work that it is, at least in the US. It would be very good to invest in the health of the people we have living on the planet now. It would be good to ask questions about the sustainability of different kinds of diets, rather than presume that by appealing to the appetites of consumers who want a burger and coming up with new ways for them to get a burger, that will end up with something sustainable in the long term. Remember that the people with the greatest financial investment in all of this are not necessarily people who have a kind of long-term plan, Isaac Asimov's foundation style, for the posterity of our generations and then for our species' future. They're people who want a certain return on their investment. I think that, in fact, one of the things that's driven people like Bruce Friedrich to the world of the startups as opposed to the world of activism is something that you said earlier, which is a desire for some kind of visible result within their lifetime. There's a kind of impatience about all of this. And I think that impatience relates very closely to the biographies of the people involved.
And in terms of, so what would you say about certain things like, so there's this, maybe this element of impatience with some of these actors who have spent a lot of time maybe trying to make inroads and not seeing the results, and are reaching a later stage of their life and want to try to see progress within their lifetime. What about this ticking clock of climate change, of global warming? Is that do you see that as maybe more of a valid concern in terms of actually saying, okay, there is kind of a sort of a red line, and we want to start trying to curb things before it gets too far out of hand?
Absolutely. I mean, and I should say, for all that I've been saying critical things about people involved in the project to create cultured meat, I have very positive things to say about one organization, New Harvest. I think they're wonderful. And they have a commitment to transparency that nobody else in the conversation really matches. But one thing I want to be careful to say is that I, by and large, share a sense of the problem. with the people who are trying to make cultured meat a reality.
Mm-hmm.
Cruelty to animals, even if you're not a utilitarian, matters in all kinds of ways. The climate crisis matters in existential ways.
Mm.
I mean, you know, just look at British Columbia over the last week. It's what's happened. I was really appalled to hear about the effects of what I think is being called the heat dome over Western Canada and the American Northwest. But I think that does that mean that new technologies are obviously the way to go? I don't think it does. I think that cultured meat is a project well worth the investments of money, time, and energy that people have been putting towards it. Because if it did work out, it would be wonderful. Mm-hmm. But it working out isn't a simple thing. You know, it working out according to whom, according to whose plans, according to who, for what meat is, for who gets to eat it, for how much they get to eat of it, who's enriched in the process. So all of these questions float over the whole scene. And no, I don't disparage the basic concern at all. Everybody I spoke to agreed that people becoming vegetarians would be the simplest solution. It is like applying Occam's razor to the whole thing and saying what makes the most sense. And as you were saying earlier, cultured meat is a sort of response to the idea that other people won't do that. And that's one of the things that I think is culturally, no pun is always intended, interesting about it. It's predicated on a certain us-them-ness. Those eaters, aren't going to convert to the chicken. They're going to insist on the burger. So what do we do?
Do you not think that's kind of, is that not kind of unavoidable? That us-themness? Is that not kind of just the nature of what it is? Maybe I'm simplified in my eyes, but if you have, I guess, a group who are saying, for the good of XYZ, we're going to be vegetarian, and you have another group who's saying we like the foods that we eat, doesn't that just maybe by default they belong to two different kind of subgroups?
Well, they might absolutely in social terms. The question is how they view each other.
That's
and the question is how they relate to one another. And I think that if you're comfortable with the idea that one group is simply to be manipulated, because they're fools and they're wrong and they should know better, they should do what we're doing, but they're not, then ask yourself what kinds of strategies that attitude tends to lead towards.
Yeah, I do think, though, to be fair, I do think there are a lot from that group. In this case, we're talking about the vegetarian group or whatever the group, who very much have tried, or there's still those who are trying to make an appeal that isn't kind of you're an idiot, you're doing things the wrong way. They come from it more of a point of let's try to make this place a better place for us all sort of approach. And I do think that a lot of times those people can be met with maybe a stone wall or kind of the inertia of the way things are.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
I agree with that. And my caricature is obviously for comedic value. No, it's true. I mean, it's not for nothing that meat is a default assumption in many places, and that it's also simply true that vegetarians, and especially vegans, are a tiny minority, even in a place like Toronto. So I suppose that I knew in writing Meat Planet that I was going to disappoint people who wanted me to tell them how to live. And what it comes down to is that my interest is simply different from that of those who wish to solve major global problems.
Mhm.
I think that the important problem is that people lack the intellectual tools often, not because they're dumb, but because they don't let themselves think things through to try to understand what the problems are.
Mm.
But they can have those intellectual tools. They can take time with the problems. And I tend to think that the assumption that there are solutions that we should move towards, and that the problem is one of action rather than one of analysis, has stranded us with conversational impasses we can't bridge. And I think that we've been illustrating that in various ways by looking at the ways in which vegetarians and vegans try to come up with strategic approaches to problems which they know they don't have a sympathetic audience.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there is a give and take between analyzing a situation to death at the expense of inaction, and is there a happy medium between that and rushing headlong into action and just saying first, just throwing stuff at the wall? Especially, like we said, there are some ticking clocks potentially. So this kind of finding that balancing act of, let's not just rush right into things. Let's think this through. Let's look at it from all these angles. But something does have to be done. Some solution has to be put forward eventually.
Oh, well, I mean, many people are putting. We don't live in a world that is short of solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Many different kinds of solutions are being put out there into the ether every day by policy people, by activists, by writers. The question, there are all kinds of organizers who are trying to galvanize people to take action.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me interesting that we frame it as a kind of dichotomy in which there's thoughtfulness on the one hand and action on the other, when in fact, there's clearly a lot of energy in the world to take different kinds of actions. It's just they're mostly self-interested.
Mm-hmm.
And there's clearly a lot of ideas. So to my mind, the interesting question is often, where is the disconnect? I very much dislike the simplified way in which I'm now presenting it. But it seems to me that the idea that the best lack all conviction and the worst are filled with, what is it, furious intensity?
The best lack all conviction. Now I'm blanking on it too.
Yeah, but we've got the principle.
Yeah.
And what that line tries to get at is the idea that throwing stuff at the wall, as you put it earlier, is often done with a feverish intensity, a furious intensity, but not a lot of thoughtfulness. And in my view, and perhaps it's because my particular hammer, such as it is the idea of pausing and reflecting. I think people could use a lot more of that, particularly when they're engaged in projects that stand to enrich some people and not others. And we haven't really been talking about the capitalism dimension of all of this in a particularly direct way, but there it is.
So what, you just mentioned this, and I'm curious if you could maybe elaborate. You just said about this, the capitalism aspect of it. What exactly is kind of the, or were you alluding to there?
Well, I don't want to draw it out too far,
Yeah.
because there's a lot on the table already, but I think it's simply obvious that cultured meat has taken the shape of a business proposition. And it's worth asking who stands to benefit and who doesn't. If huge existing industries are transformed within our lifetimes by a new kind of industry in which there will be new on its inevitable stakeholders. To say that that's good or bad misses the point. I think that the most interesting thing about it is that it's more of the same.
I have to chew on that. No pun intended.
One of the things that I think has been running through this conversation that I think is a fascinating thread is the problem of instrumentalism. And this is a problem that a group of thinkers very important to me, the Frankfurt School, mid-20th century critical theorists who fled from Nazifying Germany to North America and created a new way of bringing together philosophy, sociology, psychology, and other disciplines. Sort of took this tool, critical theory, and applied it to trajectories in European intellectual history leading from the Enlightenment to our own day. One of the major themes that they saw in that kind of line, that kind of imperatives, was instrumentalist rationality. The assumption that the way ideas take form is through a kind of problem solving, and that there's always a kind of goal directedness in our thinking. So one of the things that I try to do in Meat Planet is to say, well, here's a highly instrumentalist world, the world of Silicon Valley, the world of startups, the world of engineers. What of intellectual merit or what of exigent importance in the problems that they're looking at might they miss because of the instrumental rationality that so infuses their thinking? So that's what the book tries to do. The book tries to say there are other ways of looking at this. And one of them is that we're misconstruing the nature of the problem itself. Another is that technologies themselves are political in important, complicated ways. Robert Moses, as you said, the work of Langdon Winner. And another is that the philosophical implications of technologies might be as important as those technologies' very purported aims. Not because climate change isn't real, not because animal suffering isn't real, but because solving those things as problems might not be terribly philosophically interesting. But there's a difference between intellectual interest and the importance of problems.
You've definitely given me a lot to think about.
Well, likewise. I really appreciate the chance to talk through all of it.
Yeah, I very much appreciate you taking time out of your day to come chat. I would love to have you back on, because in doing a little reading about Meat Planet and yourself, I went down the rabbit hole of other things you've written about, and all down the rabbit hole of all the philosophy you've written about, your writings about cafes and Walter Benjamin, and a whole bunch of really interesting things that I would love to have you back and talk about another time if you are so kind as to grace me with your presence.
No, the gracing goes the opposite direction. I really appreciate your time, and I'd be very glad to chat with you again. It'll be a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Oh, thank you, Ruben. Take good care of yourself. Stay healthy, and I hope summer in Toronto is, not terribly torrid and hot.
You too, and stay healthy, stay safe, and I look forward to, fingers crossed, talking to you again soon.
Take good care.
Take care, Ben. Have a good one.
You too.
Bye.